Thank you. All right, so welcome, Anil. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much, Don, for the introduction. I'm so happy to be here for many different reasons. I became aware of this group and the amazing discussions you've had in the past, and I feel quite humbled, but also intimidated when I look at some of the speakers that you've had before and like the amazing topics that they've explored. I'm also very happy to see Arthur Dahl here. I don't know if he will remember, but when I was living in Guyana, I think in 2016, I connected with him online because I was really unsure about my academic future. And he very kindly gave some time to me to help me to think through some of what that might look like. So it's nice to see him here. And of course, I really appreciate having all of you here. I'm just going to try to um, share my screen just to make sure that that works, and then I'll continue. Can everyone see the screen? I think so. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And it should be in like presentation mode now. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe to give a little bit of background, I've just actually started my PhD. It was my 3-month anniversary at the Stockholm Resilience Center as a PhD student 2 days ago. So I won't be talking a lot about what I found. I'll be just sharing with you some of the motivations for my research, how it connects with food systems, and this idea of what are process relational perspectives and why I think it's interesting to think about food systems and food system transformation from these perspectives. Um, So let me see. Maybe I need to. Yeah. You know, prior to my PhD, this is in last October. Perhaps you're familiar with the Bahá'í World publication. It was a publication that was started by The Guardian, and a number of volumes have been released in hard copy over the decades. And in the 2000s, early 2000s, the publication was moved online, and there are articles on there from various perspectives. So last October, this article was published called Turning the Tide, Reducing Biodiversity Loss and Restoring Decimated Ecosystems. Um, so this was an article that I authored, but with a lot of help from a lot of other Baha'is. And this fed into some of my thinking about my PhD and about agriculture and food systems in particular. So if you're interested in reading some of this work, it's on the Baha'i World website. I think it's bahaiworld.com, and you can access it through baha'i.org also. Um, so I think uh, my journey in thinking about this, essentially, the reason I got involved with sustainability, environmental sciences, and ecology was really inspired by this quotation, which I think we're probably all familiar with, where Abdul Baha says that we should reflect upon the inner realities of the universe, the secret wisdoms involved, the enigmas, the interrelationships, the rules that govern all. For every part of the universe is connected with every other part by ties that are very powerful and admit of no imbalance. And for me, thinking about food systems, ecology, just seemed like such a wonderful way uh, to understand what Abdul Baha was talking about, in this quotation. At least one of the ways of doing that. And the quotation below is from a process-relational philosopher or thinker, Gilles Deleuze. And he talks about this idea of a rhizome. And this is sort of in contrast to what is called like arborescent thinking, like thinking in terms of a tree, where there's sort of a hierarchy in the tree. There's the roots, the trunk, and then of course we have the branches, leaves, fruits, etc. But I think rhizomatic thinking is more about complexity, um, that things are connected horizontally. And a rhizome, if you think about it, if you're familiar with this concept of like the rhizome as a root, it's hard to know where it begins or ends. Things are sort of always in the middle with a rhizome. And things are sort of in a state of being between. So I feel like it's a good metaphor or mental model or image for thinking about complex systems like food systems. And I'll get some more into this later on, but just as an introduction, this is sort of what grounds my thinking and inspires my thinking. And I see a connection with this and what Abdul Baha has said. Um, so I think maybe moving on and building on this idea, if we think of things as being interconnected, then we can't think about our economic system, our social system, our political system, our ecological systems as being separate systems that just somehow interact with each other. But rather they're embedded and deeply intertwined or entangled with each other. One way of seeing this is that our economic systems are embedded in social systems, which are in turn embedded in ecosystems that constitute the biosphere of the planet that we live on. And a part of the problem that causes a lot of the issues that we have with food systems, or problems with ecosystems in general, is that we tend to compartmentalize these systems, and this then has an effect on how we as individuals, communities, and societies produce and consume. So as I mentioned, so therefore, like food systems are deeply interconnected with the social, the economic, the political, and indeed the cultural systems on our planet. So this requires us to dig deeper, to develop a deeper consciousness of our interdependence with each other, um, but also to extend this deeper consciousness to our relationship with the biosphere, which, as we know, supports all life, all human life. Um, Yeah, so I think a part of when we compartmentalize things, it leads to these realities that the FAO describes, where we have this crisis with fish stocks. Two-thirds of them are fished to the limit or are overfished. And 70% of the fish population on Earth is fully used, overused, or in crisis, at least the fish populations that we know about. And food production systems are actually the main drivers of biodiversity loss globally and threaten 86% of the species that are at risk for extinction. And we have, maybe more specifically about this issue with biodiversity, we have a crisis with pollinators. And since the majority of the crops that we consume depend on some form of pollination, we are very well primed for a crisis in our global food production system, and the food supply to billions of people. So if you think about what the Universal House of Justice said in a letter sent in 2017, how does this like relate to us as individuals, as neighborhoods, as communities, and as societies? Well, they've said that every choice as an employee or employer, producer or consumer, borrower or lender, benefactor or beneficiary leaves a trace. And the moral duty to lead a coherent life demands that one's economic decisions be in accordance with lofty ideals, that the purity of one's aims be matched by the purity of one's actions to fulfill those aims. So I think if we think about this idea of producer and consumer, and that every action that we take leads a trace, then I think it brings into question, why is it that as a society we consume and we produce in the way that we do, or we view agriculture and food systems in the way we do? Why are we in the systems and structures that we're in? And I think that perhaps it might go back to a view of human nature that is reductive and limiting. So, of course, we have this view that we are self-interested, we're coldly rational, and we're driven by this desire to maximize consumption and profit. And indeed, this has been devastating to our relationship with nature. And it's been devastating because these natural systems upon which we depend, um, we see them as these repositories where we can just extract infinite resources, um, and to fulfill like our needs and our wants. So there's no thinking about the limits of these systems, and this goes back to this uh, compartmentalization and this like externalization of environmental and sustainability issues, because it's seen as being separate from our social and economic realities. And I think perhaps, I don't know how many of you live in urban areas. Maybe some of you live in more rural areas, but I think this is more pronounced in urban centers where there's this distance between the food we consume and we purchase at supermarkets, and where this food actually comes from, and the effect that those systems of production have on people, but also on the ecosystems in which they're embedded. Um, so this disconnection influences our actions, and the way we relate to nature. It's sort of out of sight, out of mind. We don't see the links between what we consume and how it's produced. So I think with that sort of maybe background and thinking, I want to go a little more into what I don't want to say my research, it's our research. I'm in a very transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary research team with three other PhDs, and our work is deeply collaborative. And currently, we're thinking about this case study in Southern Africa, in South Africa in particular, with the SAFL, the Southern Africa Food Lab. And the purpose of this lab is to transform food systems in South Africa. And they want to nourish both land and people. That's sort of their mission statement. And they're at Stellenbosch University in the Department of Agri-Science. So they have like, different approaches, but it's largely about facilitating dialogue among various actors in the food system. Naturally, this includes many farmers, people who are actually growing and producing food and are in touch with the land. But it also includes NGOs, researchers, people in academia, people who are involved with agricultural and food policy, um, and also supermarkets, CEOs of supermarkets, and representatives of large supermarkets. For example, a supermarket called SPAR, SPAR in South Africa. So they bring these people together, and they facilitate conversations about social divides. So it's a very fragmented system, and there's a lot of conflict in the food system there because of the particular history of South Africa that you might be aware of. Um, uh, I, around apartheid. In 1913, there was a Land Tenure Act that essentially transferred most of the um, viable land for agriculture in South Africa into the hands of white South Africans, and Black South Africans were left with land that was not uh, viable in terms of farming. So this is a part of this social divide that, of course, has perpetuated through apartheid, but of course is still very present in the reality of South Africans and deeply influences the food system there. So this lab is essentially trying to bridge these gaps and bring people together for dialogue. And they're also very interested in local level projects that address certain specific community needs. Right. So they have different initiatives, the transformative scenario planning, where they not just look at the past and the present, but through a deliberative process, a process of, I guess, what we would call consultation on some level. It's about thinking about what a sustainable and equitable food future would look like for South Africa. And I won't go into all of this, but I think there's no particular model towards which they're moving in terms of like farming systems, but there are strong I don't know, tendencies that have arisen towards like transitioning towards more agroecological models of farming and approaches to farming. And of course, nutrition is really important here. And I'll talk about this a little later, that despite, many rural South Africans being involved in agriculture and producing fresh, healthy food, for various reasons, there are nutritional deficiencies. For example, you have these strange situations in which, for decades, people have been growing traditional foods that they have been growing for hundreds of years, but there's a transition, to monocropping, and growing foods that they can then sell to markets and supermarkets. And this has resulted in decreasing like the diversity of the type of food they consume, but also consuming more processed foods. So this is not just in the urban centers, but this is a widespread public health issue in South Africa. Okay. All right. So what I mentioned earlier that our research here, a big part of it is thinking about food systems through process relational perspectives. And I really wanted to avoid getting too conceptual in this presentation because when I talk to people about process relational perspectives, it can seem very philosophical, which it is. It's a type of philosophy, but it's being more and more employed in food system research. And hopefully I I can convey some of that, but my own thinking around this is developing because I'm new in the PhD program. So I also maybe you can help me to think through some of this. So essentially it's grounded in the idea that we can't think of the world as just static objects, but the world is in a continuous process of becoming. We as individuals, we're constantly changing, but the world itself is the physical aspect of the world is in the continuous process of becoming something else. So there's an emphasis here on dynamism, on evolving relationships, and the way interactions happen within systems. So if you think about this in terms of food systems, I think it's particularly useful in helping us to understand how change, adaptation, and transformation can occur. And a part of this is because of how complex food systems are. Um, they're not linear. It's not A plus B equals C, and then you can think about transformation in a food system in that way. But there are so many complex interactions that make it difficult both to understand what's happening in a food system, why it's happening, and then to even get to a point where you can design policy and manage such systems. So complexity is a big issue here. And the hope is that this perspective might help us to understand some of that. So this is based on a particular type of ontology. You know, ontology is you can think of it as a way of beliefs or ways of thinking about how the world is made up. Like what fundamentally, like what makes it up. So as I mentioned before, like we're not isolated entities, but we're in this constant process of forming and reforming relationships. So some of the thinkers that have really written a lot about this are Deleuze and Barad, and they emphasize what they called like flat ontologies, where all elements of the system contribute to to like food system dynamics, for example. So it's not just the humans in the system that sort of play this very central role, but we have to think about all elements. And this could be policies, this could be like ideas, traditional ways of thinking about food systems, but also that the material aspects of a food system, the plant itself, the seed, the soil, that these things have some degree of agency within the food system and are alive and dynamic and interact with us as human beings and change us as we change them. So I talked about this before. I won't go too much into it, but maybe I talked about complex adaptive systems before, but I'm particularly interested in attractors. Like what is it that stabilizes us or keeps us in unsustainable patterns? And what are things that can attract us, create new patterns and ways of moving away from those stable systems? So you can think about this as like dominant agricultural practices, policy frameworks, or even cultural narratives, or large scale industrial agriculture that contributes a lot to the ecological problems that we have. What are new patterns that we can create that move us away from that? So it's helpful for me to think about a food system, going back to the earlier slide I showed, as like a rhizomatic system, that it's nonlinear, it's dynamic, it's fluid. And I am thinking especially about something called assemblage theory. So there are different ways from a research perspective, that you can think about complex systems. Sometimes it involves like drawing diagrams where there's the farmer and there's a line going towards something else. But I much prefer this assemblage theory, and I prefer it because it allows you to think about process and change over time. So, how things combine in different assemblages, how they disassemble, how they might reassemble and reconfigure in different ways, producing like ever changing outcomes. So this presents both a challenge, because how do you do that from a research perspective? Usually we take a snapshot of something and we try to examine a system as a snapshot. And we also try to reduce that system to certain aspects that we want to understand. But this is really trying to capture a lot more about that. So food systems are open-ended, they're adaptable, and they reconfigure in relation to like policies, to new ways of thinking, to climate change, for example. So how does the food system adapting and changing? And this might allow like new solutions and strategies, new ways of thinking to emerge in such a system. In particular, because I think it's well adapted to maybe not thinking about large scale systems, but how do food systems manifest in unique contexts and the unique challenges that emerge in those contexts. So a lot of the research has been very like locally based type of research. Okay, so I don't want to go too much into this because as I said, it can be quite conceptual. But there is this idea of what is called like seeing like practices in food systems as material discursive practices. So one way of thinking about this is that how do humans, non-humans, or more than humans interact, and how do they interact with like systems of power within food systems? So who has the power? How do they exercise this power? What kind of power do individuals have? What kind of power do individuals and communities have that they might not know that they have? And how through a action research process can we reveal that and think and reflect on that more and maybe realize that there's more agency in communities and individuals than we previously thought about. And another important aspect of this is that ontology, which is how is the world made of, epistemology, how do we know the world, and ethics are deeply intertwined. You can't think about one without the other when you're thinking about process relational perspectives. So this brings a lot into this way of thinking about values, about norms, about spiritual qualities, spiritual ways of doing the world that might not be so included in research or seen as being integral aspects of research. Ethics is sometimes seen as sort of a sideshow because it's more important to think about how we know the world. But in this perspective, it's particularly important that these things are intertwined and entangled. All right, I've talked about some of this before about becoming, so I won't go into that. So, traditional approaches to food systems rely on these like sort of static models. Um, and I mentioned that it allows us to see food systems as evolving and adaptive. And I think particularly important here is to think not just about what's happening in the present or the future, but how the past, present, and future are intertwined and shape current outcomes, shapes the future, but also shapes the way we see the past. So you can imagine in a place like South Africa, the colonial history and the history of apartheid is not something that's in the past. It's deeply entangled in the present food system. And who are the winners and losers in such a system? It affects the way we grow food and we think about food. And therefore, how we think about the future. It can really limit the way we think about how we can transform a food system in the future. Right. So one way, practical way of doing this is creating open-ended transformative spaces like the one that the Southern Africa Food Lab has created. And this is spaces in which we can think about new relational configurations and how these can be like nurtured and strengthened. And more importantly, how new forms of agency and ways in which individuals and communities can actually affect transformation come to the foreground. So it's not about this research is not about designing interventions, that bring about change or mark some abrupt new point of departure. There's not like a point that it will describe in the future, which if we do such and such transformation will happen, but that we are in a long-term process of transformation. So the researchers here are deeply embedded in the processes of change, and they see themselves more as process facilitators or as curators of these relationships in a food system in particular contexts. All right. So, in terms of transformations of food systems, this allows us to think about like how small changes, for example, in the narratives that we have around food systems, can lead to significant shifts. So, I'll give an example. Um, uh, this idea of agroecology in a place called Inchanga in South Africa, through the process with the Southern Africa Food Lab, new narratives around how they farm, the sort of inputs that they need for farming, why it's important to farm in a way that is very careful about the effect on the ecosystems around them. These ideas became more important through this dialogue, and it served as an attractor, a way of like changing the food system in that particular locality. So now most of the farmers in this area are thinking about this transition to more regenerative agriculture. So, for example, how can we really think about soil and the way our food production systems affect soil? And what does it mean for the future generations who will be farming in this area? But of course, there are contradictions, and I'll share one with you about this area. Uh, as I said, many farmers are growing food and producing food in this agroecological way. And you would imagine that they would then feed that food to their children. But I think this is where food systems are particularly complex, and we see power and market dynamics influencing people. Actually, what happens, a lot of that healthy, fresh food leaves that local community, is sold to supermarkets. The farmers themselves actually buy more processed food with that money, and that's the food that they're feeding to their children, and that's the food that's more present in their community. So it's not just about the ways of producing and it being more agroecological, but it's how is this connected to these wider systems, and how do we think about social, economic, political aspects of this when we're thinking about transformation. So this is an ongoing discussion, and also the link to nutrition that I mentioned earlier. Where do we see glimmerings of hope in our own community, in our Baha'i community? So you might be familiar with these examples, but I think they're quite interesting and instructive. So you might know about the Program for Social Action through Fundaek. And this is a program that's helping participants to approach agriculture in a more coherent manner. Coherent in the sense that spiritual insights are integrated with like agricultural practices and ways of thinking about farming. They go hand in hand. They're deeply intertwined, both in the material and the reflection spaces and the way in which these participants engage with what they describe as action research. So, for example, when a new technology is introduced into a community, I'll give an example of this. This is weighed in terms of its effect on the spiritual and material aspects of community life. So, for example, they learn about organic fertilizers, composting, and managing a seed bank. These are some very like practical aspects of what they do. And of course, all of these topics have implications for biodiversity and ecosystem management, particularly because of how they think about technology and other agricultural inputs like fertilizers and pesticides. And I think more importantly, they're gaining a greater consciousness about their relationship to the land as a living entity in the world that has a deep spiritual effect on them, and is not just something that is there to help us to produce something that we then use. But that we have a reciprocal relationship with the land. So here's a picture of some of the participants in Uganda they're making organic fertilizers and pesticides, and they're involved with the PSA program. I particularly love this example because I think that it is an amazing glimmering of hope and transformation in food systems. So um, there was this really big development organization that had access to lavish funds, and they were promoting corn, maize monoculture systems in this particular area. It's a very rural area in Uganda. And this required high use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And this development organization approached a group of Ugandan youth. And these youth were involved with the PSA program, and of course, discussing some of these things I mentioned earlier with their tutor and with the community there of farmers and others who were engaged with PSA. And actually, instead of accepting this proposal, which would have had, it would have helped them financially, it would have given them some maybe economic security, access maybe to jobs, the land that they were farming, they would get good money for it. But instead of accepting this proposal, the youth started asking some very critical questions about the long-term economic impacts and environmental sustainability of what this development organization was doing. And after considering this with their tutor, they chose not to adopt this system and said to the tutor that we will no longer blindly follow the popular systems of the region that they're in. I think this is something that's, I mean, can you imagine these protagonists in a community helping others to think in this way also, and this amazing impact that the writings of the faith, but also combined with scientific insights, are having on these young people who are making these very courageous decisions. So I see these things as, in a research perspective, I would describe these as like attractors in food systems that help us to move away from these unsustainable states or patterns and create new narratives about the way we relate. So, this narrative of food sovereignty, climate smart agriculture, but also narratives around equity and sustainability then become like the guiding principles for our thinking about food systems. I'm conscious of time because I'm hoping we can have a discussion, but I think this is another important aspect of process-relational research, and this is indigenous, local, and traditional knowledge systems. And I'm particularly interested in the way that indigenous peoples across the world think about time, not as being something linear, but circular and cyclical. And we also have this in the Bahá'í faith, of course. We talk about cycles, right? The Adamic cycle, for example. But an example of this is this Aborigine group, the Noongar, where they have these like spiral or cyclical views of time, where long ago, now, and future are all present all present in the present. So the spirits of the place, the ancestors, the stories, the past events, including colonialism, are here in the ongoing present. So stories live in places and they belong and are rooted in places. And there are elders in the communities, the Bidia, who hold such knowledge and provide leadership through those knowledge pathways, here referred to as a Bidi. So maybe like from a more academic perspective, like these can be thought of as like post-humanist performative perspectives. So time is not this container or a backdrop in a system, but it emerges from like relationships with each other, but also relationships with the past, the present, and the future. So learning is an experience. It's something we experience. So we draw on the past, the traditional knowledge, the local knowledge that has existed for centuries, and millennia even, to think about the present and the future of a food system, for example. And there are some nice examples here, that I won't go too deeply into. Um, but this idea, I love this example of the forest in which death is the foundation of the future. Like the death within a forest creates new opportunities for the future. And if you think about what's going on in our society right now, I think it's a great analogy. It's the dying of this old world order, and we really have to nurture these seeds of possible change for the future. I think, particularly in the United States now, unfortunately. Um, yeah, so I won't go too much into this post-humanist performative thing because I'm also trying to understand it, but I think time and change are important aspects about the way we think about food systems. So these are some like practical applications that I see is that we can have novel ways of doing research, um, that include more about this relationality of the farmer and technology and ideas and concepts and spiritual values and how they help us to think about transformation. And, local indigenous knowledge is not just something exotic or that we think about because we get these very fuzzy spiritual feelings. But no, this is uh, an integral aspect of transformation and food system transformation. And it provides an imperative that we have to draw on these systems of knowledge if we want to see change. And some of the other ways are listed here. I won't go too much into that. So I think I'll stop there, because I've taken much longer than I wanted to. But hopefully, this has given you like a flavor of some of my thinking around food systems, and perhaps some of it is very abstract at the moment, but it's very abstract for me at the moment. So I think I'll just stop there, and I think we usually have like a discussion now in this space. So thank you very much for listening so patiently.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Anil. I think I'm going to have to listen to this a few more times and stop along the way to catch everything. There was so much there. Really, so many great thoughts. Um, we do have one hand up right now. Arthur?
Thank you. I really appreciated the presentation. As a complex system scientist myself, I've worked on these issues for 50 years, and it's nice to see the next generation picking this up and running with it and putting it into practice in very practical ways while also exploring all the deeper meanings of that. Uh, Recently, I've been working on complex systems at the governance level. I don't know if you've seen the recent book by Adam Day, published a couple of weeks ago, uh, called The Forever Crisis. And he's looking more about at the governance level, but it's deeply rooted in complex systems thinking and the dynamics of how we need to change governance and be very relevant to your research. There's a summary of it on the IF website. I put a link into the chat for those who want to look at it. The book itself is full of academic references, so I did a summary of the main ideas without all of the heavy academic side of it for those who want it on the IF website. But I think you're doing wonderful work there. I was also, as you're going through, I thought this is so close to indigenous thinking as I've seen it in the Pacific Islands, where they're part of the soil and the trees and so on. They see it in a very organic, evolving way, and so when I saw you at the end, you came to that. It resonates so well with what we're trying to preserve and take forward in other indigenous communities with their food systems, even though they've lost so much with colonialism. That's been destroyed much of that, but they're trying to rebuild what they can. So keep up your wonderful work. We'll see more of it coming in the future. I'm sure it's exciting to see what you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, Wendy, did you want to speak? Just a second. You need to unmute.
Is that okay?
Yes, good.
Okay. Well, I'm going to speak from the opposite of the academic side because I'm the person that's got their hands in the soil. And I can share with you from the ground level, literally, what's going on in my world. First of all, I think we have to realize that we can only really change the area that we're in contact with and the people that we're around on the ground floor foundational level, which I love all the ideas, concepts. I get all that. It all makes sense. You know, I don't have any conflicts there. I think we need to get our hands in the dirt and start doing what we're talking about. I, for instance, have volunteered at a small organic farm that's trying to get their feet under them, which is really difficult. One of the difficulties that you kind of mentioned is that the regulations and the compensation, let's see, how do you say it? Like the system that we live here in the US, the agricultural products that are subsidized are not the ones that you grow in the organic garden and come to the farmers markets. So the prices of them are higher than the commodities that you find in the grocery stores. So there's a system that needs to be reworked, and I think it's in the process now. But that's part of it. And that, you know, you mentioned time. Time is as many hours as you are awake, you're working when you're actually in the agricultural world. And what can you get done? And what I've seen happen is that all these smaller farms, ranchettes, whatever you want to call them in this country, are producing the food that is more outside of the large agricultural complexes is highly sought after. It is a little more costly, so we have that social dilemma with who gets to buy it and who doesn't, although some of it does get donated to the food banks in all the communities graciously. So there is a little bit out there for others. So these people are coming together, and there's, you know, the Baha'i concept isn't even infiltrating to their knowledge in what's going on, but it is happening because they're supporting one another. They're reaching out to each other. They're investing in time and trying to get somebody else's products at their place and vice versa. So there's a lot of sharing going on. There's a huge amount of people more and more interested. And the other thing that I do is I buy almost all my food from it. I'll say the word. It's Azure Standard, which is a warehouse that I order from online, and I get a semi that comes to town. I'm the coordinator of it, and people come and meet the semi and pick up their food that they've ordered, and it's way more nutritious, organic. You got to cook from scratch. It's not the packaged stuff. So the other comment is that if we're getting the kids involved, and it's starting to happen in the schools where you're getting the kids involved in growing the things that, and then they cook the things, they fix the things, they eat the things that they grow, they get more engaged in what, like milk doesn't come from a carton, it comes from so-and-so's farm, and they bring it and you get to have it. You know, you have a day and maybe you'll make bread, or, you know, you get the kids in contact with what actually the process is, and there's a huge buy-in. So I think we have to incorporate all that into all the things that you're talking about. and try to figure out how to not just make it an intellectual process. It's got to be hands-on, and we got to start with the young people. And we've got to also work on all the legislation and all the rules that restrict this and make it less expensive in some regard, or because the packaged food always gets bought when it comes to money in place of, the real orange. So somehow we've got to figure that one out. And the nutritional quality is always my first go-to. Health is always my first and foremost thing that I look at. So how can I do that? So how can we do that with the rest of the world? But that's just a real rough picture of what it looks like a little bit on the ground level. And I'll tell you one quick little story, and then I'm going to let somebody else talk. Last summer, or a couple summers ago, I was planting lettuce transplants into the ground along with another woman. We were doing the same area, same plant, same. For some strange reason, the ones I planted, grew remarkably better than the ones she did. So my takeaway was that it's like, why? I think the heart and soul, the love we put into things grow better. It's like there's a whole nother level that we're not even thinking about. As Baha'is touch things change. And it's a wonderful thing. So there's consequences out there that we're really unaware of that I think is really remarkable. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Anil, have you got any thoughts on Wendy's comments?
I think that it's hard to disagree with anything that Wendy just said. I think, if you think about what Abdul Baha says, that all should be producers, right? I feel like that's what Wendy's talking about, that in some way or another, we all should be involved, right? With agriculture and producing, and how to transform our thinking and our approaches and our way of life that can somehow move towards that, I think is a big project, a big question. But I do find these things that are the Baha'i community is involved in, these social action projects in different parts of the world, to be great examples of where we could be heading, and I'm particularly inspired when I see young people getting involved in that. And for me, like the research for the next 4 years will be hopefully action research. I'm not sitting behind a desk and thinking about these things, but I'm out there. But academia has a lot that it needs to work on also, so that it's not disconnected from people's realities. So I'm hoping to avoid that. So maybe I'll talk to Wendy more about that as we go along.
Great. Thank you. Paula?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Paula from Germany. I came in late, so I might have not gotten the whole picture of your presentation. My question is your research mainly focusing on South Africa?
At the moment, but I'm exploring things possibly in Europe, but also in Uganda, Democratic Republic of Congo. But right now, it's in South Africa.
Okay, thank you. Then my thoughts as I was listening to the complexity of your presentation. I'm talking as a retired public health nutritionist. So I very much appreciate the complexity that goes into what you are doing. When the focus is on, in the beginning, mostly on South Africa, I'm just wondering because I'm a little bit familiar with the history of South Africa, and I also have visited a couple of times and also did some work there in South Africa. And I think it was in 2010 where I visited, after my work, I visited some rural areas and an NGO in a rural area. And I became aware that even in 2010, there was still such extreme injustice in terms of the white and the black population. And in rural areas, I mean, even kids were even not even put in school when they lived on farms. So I was really shocked still in 2010. So my question then is, when you look at the food system in the South African context, I want to share my favorite quote with you because I think it could be very important given the history of South Africa. We cannot segregate the human heart from the environment inside us and say that once one of these is reformed, everything will be improved. Man is organic with the world. His inner life molds the environment and is itself deeply affected by it. The one acts upon the other, and every abiding change in the life of man is the result of these mutual reactions. So that's why I ask you whether your focus is on South Africa, because I felt now it's 2025. I don't know how much it has changed, but I remember when there were this unrest in Durban, how people just ransacked grocery stores and supermarkets for food. Yeah, so yeah, I wonder whether the for South Africa, this change of human heart is so important. Thank you very much for your work.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, Don. Go
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I think it's change on so many levels, the individual, the institutions, and the community. The three protagonists that the Universal House of Justice encourages us to think about. But South Africa is like many other places, it just has interesting features, right? The government in 2014 talked about redistributing land to Black South Africans. And they had a goal of 30% of that land being, I can't remember, being done by why. So 10% of that land, according to some figures, has been redistributed to Black South Africans. The people who now have that land, they don't have access to capital, they don't have access to capacity building and skills training, and oftentimes that land is also just not viable. It's not good land for farming. So you have, like, you see, I think this is when we just isolate things and we think that a policy or a government is going to change things, but we're not thinking about all aspects of the problem and how they interact, right? And I feel like the Baha'i community has learned a lot about that, and is trying to think about things in a more holistic way. And of course, our experience is quite nascent; it's modest at the moment. But I can see that as it grows, some of these issues will be addressed, particularly capacity building, which you see happening in Uganda, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, parts of Colombia, through this program for social action, which has reached quite large numbers in these rural areas, I might add. So it's not just a few groups. This is having like an impact now on the food system in these areas.
Yes. Ned, Janet?
Hi. So I'm just wanting to point out something that needs to be researched more thoroughly or included in the research, and that is the position of women. And the reason I say that is because I've been working in Uganda, and over 54% of girls under 19 have had babies, and none of them want babies. And teenagers don't know about nutrition, and they don't have access to anything to even feed the children. And most of the farming is done by women, and traditionally they did agroecology, and there's a big push to promote it, and we have tree nurseries everywhere and so on. But only 7% of the land is owned by women, so they don't have a say over what they grow. So I've been to places where there's nothing but sugarcane to the doorstep, and the children are malnourished. And so the impact of women is a big one. And even that project Drawdown talked about what is the single most important thing we could do to affect climate change, and it's to educate girls and women. So I don't know how that's going to be brought into, but there's a quotation from Abdul Baha. He says that when this approach, he's using the model of Adazia, is, of institute, the individual and the community is got agriculture at its heart, then there'll be no more war. Well, I don't think anything's going to happen when most of the agriculture around the world is done by women on smallholder farms, yet they have no say. Nothing's going to change. So I think the project Drawdown and educating girls and women is really important. And I don't know how you can bring that into your research.
Good point. He's nodding and smiling.
I'm sure Richard wants to go, but I'll just say that I think it's crucial. It goes without saying. We're a group of Baha'is, I think, mostly on this call, so we would agree that in principle, that's what needs to happen in so many different spheres. In this locality in South Africa that I described, one of the areas in which they see change can happen more quickly is working with the women who are farmers, particularly because they are more interested in not just maybe selling for profit and maximizing the profit, but they are thinking a lot about their children and what their children eat. So when they talk to them about nutrition, like traditional foods that were once there, why are we no longer eating it? Why are we eating more processed food? That discussion resonates more with them than it does perhaps with the men. Right. So I think for many, it's the women that are more interested in these discussions in the communities because they're closer to the family, they're closer to their children, and are frankly more spiritually minded in many ways. Like, I don't have to get into that. Abdul Baha lays that out very clearly, right, in the writings. So I think maybe I'll have to credit you in at the end of the PhD for making that a research question or something like that. Sorry, I know Richard.
Thank you. Richard?
Yes, thank you again for this presentation. Helps everyone to think in a more coherent way. As I'm thinking about some of these things and appreciating things that others have already shared today, those who practically have their hands in the ground, my experience has been in a relatively short period of time that I've been involved in agriculture, is that those who are doing the work, whether they're male or female, are some of the least paid people in those communities, and many of them, their jobs are part-time, and the rest of the year they either don't have work or they have work that's also part-time that's often not paying benefits of health care and these kind of things. And they're very real. So when we think about sustainable systems, uh, in the economy, the social economy of that aspect is those who are providing food and nutrition for the rest of community needs to be able to sustain life at least with shelter and food and healthcare and these kind of things. So are things that come to my mind when I'm thinking about this. And then, you know, I feel like in America, although we're thinking about this very much at the philosophical and intellectual levels, I feel like still we are at very nascent stages. Even those who are striving to be involved in their community and help people to think about these things, we're at a nascent stage of transforming communities with these thoughts. And as I strive to get involved in those circles with people, and I think about the younger people, when we look at South America, Latin America, African countries who are involved in the Program for Social Action, the closest thing that we have to that in America is the Junior Spiritual Empowerment Program. And we have almost very little of the text that are truly the Program for Social Action. And they're very difficult to get your hands on. And I understand the why behind that, but it's a reality. How do we, in small areas, with the programs that we have, to reach this level of organic change with the younger people? The current texts that we have, which are significantly more than what we had 2 years ago, 5 years ago, are helping us to get there, but they're just a small degree of the amount of curriculum that they have with the program of social action that's used in these other areas. And so to engage young people in agricultural communities where in reality there's probably low numbers of Baha'is. When you're reaching people initially, you're engaging them in conversations that are about their reality, and you eventually engage in more deeper spiritual conversations where you can introduce these concepts. But these concepts that we introduce need to be more than just something that you're going to meet with a junior youth once a week. It's about creating a change in the way life exists. And so if we're talking about in a community, how are the spiritual subjects they're going to study directly relate to their life on a day-to-day basis? So these are some of the things that come to my mind as we think about the reality of putting this into the practical.
Thank you, Richard. We do have a few comments here in the chat. Mark Griffin has posted a couple of things here about drawdown estimates and family planning, including family planning in education, and it looks like a chart. Also, Winnie, did you want to say something? You're talking about permaculture.
Okay. I always am grateful to Arthur who has been so aware and so involved in policy, trying to engage with policy in governments and on the world stage. Because in the early days when I was learning about permaculture, I thought, my goodness, why are they talking about government in this thing? And now I get it completely. And I'm grateful also to our speaker for showing how everything is related to everything else. And I'm grateful to Richard for bringing up a concern that agriculture working group folks have had, that we would love to see a curriculum for young people that incorporated more of what you're speaking of. So always happy with these presentations and encourage those of you that are new to go down the list that is on the invitation, and you will be thoroughly enriched by tuning into some of those that Dawn has put on YouTube for us. Thank you.
Thanks. Isabel?
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much for that, for well, everybody. I wasn't planning on speaking. This is my first time here. But one of the things that interested me in the course of your discussion was, maybe I'm getting it wrong, but I'm kind of perceiving it as a retrospect, like looking back into the way that Indigenous people have traditionally used the land. Now, I live in Northern Ontario. People are doing everything from, spreading their fertilizers by using drones, to going back to very old and traditional forms of agriculture, like small truck farms. We have multi-million-dollar dairy farms, and we have smallhold, small lease, and people that are reclearing the land. And I just find it really interesting because it also seems to affect the whole idea of farming. For example, when I've worked for the local newspaper for many years, and I've covered a lot of agricultural issues. And one of the things that I find when I go to these events, like that are often sponsored by government agencies like the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, that there's more and more interest in diversifying, number one. But there's also a lot of investment in things like going into cash cropping and other areas. We're in a little bit of an area that we have like the whole notion of agriculture is diversifying, including the history and looking at the way that Aboriginal people did things in the past, and the notion that they actually farmed the wildlife here. For example, burning off in early spring when there's still snow on the ground so that forest fires didn't happen, but it burnt the blueberry bushes. Those bushes would produce greater crops that would bring in more wildlife. And, re-examining these ways of doing things. And I'm just wondering, because you kind of like talked about that a little bit in your South African experience. And I was just wondering if that is something that is of interest.
Yeah, I mean, I'm personally super interested in learning more about that, because I think it's like an example of what I was trying to articulate. So I think there's something about the way we think about the past as not being something that is in the past alone. I don't know how else to say it. Like the Baha'u'llah talks about the souls in the next world being like the leaven, I don't know how to say that word, but that they're the cause of like the progress of the sciences and the arts in this world. And I think there's a lot that Indigenous people know about that, about the ancestors and the role they play in their present. But I'm also interested in how we think about the future, right? How do we imagine different ways of doing things? And then, because I think a part of what motivates action is this vision that Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha have talked about in the future. If we are just thinking about the past of the United States, and thinking about the present, and not thinking about the world order letters and the vision that the Guardian has painted, right? I think we're going to be pretty stuck because it's easy to become very hopeless about the situation. And I think I you know I so I a part of it is like an intellectual conceptual exercise for me about time and the future and the past and so on. But I feel like there are things that it helps us to think about and do differently when we draw on these like knowledge systems. And a part of that is a very like understanding spiritual reality, that the past, present, and future are illusions. Like in the next world, there is no such thing, right? And there's an influence on our thinking that that can have. And I think it foregrounds the importance of traditional, local, indigenous knowledge. And why it needs to come into our way of thinking. Yeah,
Can
but
I
maybe
share
I'll.
a very small example? I mean, I have hundreds of examples of this collected over the years, but I had a friend who, I mean, everybody goes berry picking around here. It's just a tradition. Everybody does it. And one year I went berry picking with him. He happened to be Indigenous, and he admonished me at one point. He says, "Don't pick all the berries off the bush. You always have to leave some. You do, and then there's always one bush that you don't pick anything off. That's the mother bush." And I just thought that that was really interesting.
Yes.
I realize that we're low on time, and I know Ned has a comment, but I just wanted to, before we get too low on time, I think what Richard pointed out for me is maybe not what he pointed out, but what he was getting at, as I understand it, is that we really just need to like think very carefully about the 9-year plan of the Universal House of Justice, which is a part of a 25-year endeavor. Or it's a whole generation, essentially. And these things about the junior youth texts and so on. These books. I don't know how many people are familiar, but observation and insight, thinking about numbers, the habits of an orderly mind. These are just three that I can think of that I see being directly connected with agriculture and food systems, even if it's not explicit. But I think we need to make that explicit in the right context. And the only way to do that is to talk to many, many people. Like, there's a lot of focus on, oh, what is the institute process? Does it work? Oh, what are the materials we're using? But I think we need to talk a lot more about the time and energy and resources that we're putting in to building a local community of people, right? How many people are we talking to on a weekly basis, a monthly basis, wherever we are in whatever reality? Because there's no doubt that questions around agriculture and food systems will come to the fore, right? But it has to be a grassroots movement that is going to bring about some of these changes. I'm not ignoring structural and bigger aspects, but I think there's some connections with the 9-year plan that we need to make and really run with it if we're going to see some of these changes that we need to see. That's why I just really liked what Richard, his comment earlier. Yeah.
This is to follow up what Richard said, that there is a junior youth package coming out. It's called, it's from the Rui Institute, and it's called Appreciation for Nature, Ecological Camps, Bahá'í Junior Youth Groups. So this is all curriculum prepared with lessons and everything. So I don't know, I can send it to you, but there's so many ways of including agriculture in, for example, Rui Book 3 for children. Lesson 9 is about see the earth, it's so humble. See the tree is so humble, has all God's wealth to give. That's actually already a children's class, which, and we just had a festival where we made miniature gardens with the children and grow seeds. And there's so many ways that we can include it. Kevin Locke used to have towers, food towers in the classrooms, and the children would grow vegetables in the classroom. So there's many examples where there's such complex things, but where we can break it down into simple things that we could do every day that would make a difference. And then people grow. Three of the youth at the children's festival had been in my preschool 15 years ago. So you just don't know, where does it go? They're going to study. One of them we just met is going to study agriculture. So we just, when we put the seeds out, we don't know where it's going to end up, but we need to put the seeds out.
That's right. Okay, I think we have one more comment, and then I think we'll need to close. We need to let Anil go. Christine.
Yes, first, thank you very much, Anil, for that wonderful presentation. It was very stimulating and just wonderfully enriching for all of us. I just have a very quick question for Janet. That book, Appreciation for Nature, is that a very old book that you still have from 20, 30 years ago? That was just a draft, or is that something that is being newly developed that might come out and be available for everyone?
I wish I knew, but it's Bahá'í Ecological Youth Camp's Guide to the Collaborators. I don't think it's that old, but I think I got it from Nagme Headley. Darren Headley's wife, Nagme, is from Colombia. So I think that's where she was using it. It might be older than I think, but I'm not sure. I can send it to you.
No, it's fine.
I just have hard copy, but
thank you very much, Janet.
Yeah, I also wanted to mention in Uganda, if Anil is going to Uganda, you need to see Judith Bakiria. She has an agroecology training center, and she trains lots of farmers, over 1,000. Yeah, she learned from her grandmother. Yeah, she's a Baha'i.
Yeah, I would love to. Maybe I'll message you just to get that contact. Yeah.
Great.
You can also hear her on one of our presentations if you look down the list.
Right. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. It's really appreciate you, Anil, for being with us today and sharing some of your work. And as many people said already, we're really encouraged to see younger people taking up these issues and doing the research and spreading the information. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll keep everyone in my prayers, and please keep me in your prayers also. Hopefully we meet in person at some point. Much love to you all.
Thank you. Come to Canada. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you. Bye-bye.